A solid bench mallet is a must-have tool in any woodworking shop. Like clamps, you can never have too many, and you always want to have one within reach. This mallet has a weighted head to pack an extra punch, and thumb indents for choking up on the handle when a more delicate touch is needed. The head of the mallet is comprised of two identical pieces that are glued together to make the final thickness. We'll start by cutting the thumb indents in each half of the head. This cut is made by clamping the workpiece at an angle on the table using the auxiliary fence. To make the teardrop-shaped indent, a portion of the bow tie template is used with the white side 3/4 inch round nose bit from the PantoRouter Specialty Bit Pack. It's available on our website. The exact location and the size of this indent can vary depending upon your hand size and what feels comfortable. Using the center scale of the PantoRouter setup ruler, mark the mortise location on the inside face of the halves. After consulting the segmented mortise and tenon chart, we determined the mortise for the handle to be 3/4 inch thick by 1 5/8 inch wide and about 2 3/4 inches long. It's important to mark the location so the mortises that hold the weights in the mallet head don't intersect. Next, install the vertical template holder adapter on the template holder and center it with the guide-bearing shaft before tightening it down. Select an appropriate size template for the weights being used. We're using some large steel nuts as weights because that's what we had lying around, but fishing weights or lead shot, steel shot would also work well. To accommodate the steel nuts, we used a tapered end of the 6mm guide bearing inside the template to cut a mortise larger than the diameter of the bit. After the mortises are cut, check the fit of the weights, then glue the two halves together. Once the glue is dry and squeeze-out removed, we cut the through mortise in our mallet head. Since the depth of cut exceeds the maximum cut capacity of the 3/4 inch router bit, we plunged in about halfway, then rotated the workpiece 180 degrees to finish the cut from the other side. This requires the mallet head to be centered on the table, and a center line wrapping all the way around all sides of the mallet head makes this easy to confirm before cutting. Since this will be a through mortise and tenon, we use the innermost step on the template to make a perfect fitting mortise and tenon with no lateral movement. With the mortise cut, we move on to the tenon on the handle. The head of the mallet is approximately 2 5/8 inches tall, so our tenon will need to be about 2 3/4 inches so it protrudes slightly for the flush cutting after glue up. We cut the majority of the tenon using the standard spiral upcut bit, which offers superior dust collection and an incredibly clean cut. We're making a couple of these mallets, so we installed the swing stop in the third slot on the table to get a repeatable tenon length on each handle. If you're only doing one, there's no need to use the swing stop for this application. Rather than setting the depth to the maximum cut capacity of the spiral bit, we cut a 1 inch long tenon, then adjust the depth stop to go deeper with the second pass. This provides the very best control. At this stage, the guide bearing is towards the back of the template, which will produce a tenon that we know will be too tight, but we're going to sneak up on the perfect fit in the next step. Once we reach the maximum depth of cut for the spiral upcut bit, we change to a longer straight bit of the same diameter. Spiral upcut bits of this length are available, but they're unusual and pretty expensive, and we use this bits of this length so rarely that the straight bit's really more than adequate. Using a small combo square, we measured the height of the mallet head and mark a line on the mallet handle referencing off the end of the tenon. We aligned the tip of the router bit approximately a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch past the reference line. This does not need to be precise as long as the tenon is longer than the depth of the mortise. As we cut the remainder of the tenon, it's immediately clear how much of the long straight bit protrudes past the dust hood brush and how the dust collection suffers. This would have been a really dusty cut if we'd used that extra long bit for the entire tenon. When the full length of the tenon is cut, we can begin to dial in the size of the tenon by adjusting the guide bearing location on the template taper. Test the fit after each adjustment using the mortise and the mallet head. There's no need to try to slide the mallet head all the way onto the handle at this point. Once the tenon is complete, leave the workpiece clamped in the same position. Change out the template to cut vertical slots in the tenon for the wedges. It happened to work out that the two vertical templates pushed together created a spacing that looked good. But depending on the desired spacing, a single vertical template can also be used for one slot. Then the workpiece can be flipped for the other slot. With an 1/8 inch bit installed in the router, cut the slots in the end of the tenon. The length of the 1/8 inch bit is limited, but this will provide a nice consistent width for the wedges to match the thickness of the inlay, and the slots can be cut deeper on the bandsaw afterwards. Leaving the 1/8 inch bit and the vertical templates in place, the grooves for the decorative inlay can be cut in the mallet head. This detail is strictly aesthetic and can be changed based on the desired end result or skipped altogether, but this is a good example of how the PantoRouter can be used for much more than strictly functional joinery. For this project, the inlay wraps around all four sides of the mallet head and aligns with the wedges in the end of the through tenon. This is accomplished by cutting each face, then rotating the workpiece. With the tenon cut, we can now shape the handle. This is where personal preference, comfort, and aesthetics play a big role. We opted for a flared base inspired by the shape of a fawn's foot axe handle, which helps to prevent the mallet from sliding out of the hand in use, but we made it symmetrical so either side of the head can be used. A fair curve was drawn and cut on a piece of scrap plywood to make a simple pattern routing jig. Then the handle stock was cut to length. The curve was transferred onto the handle and cut out on the bandsaw. We saved the cutoffs as these can always be used to hold the workpiece when cutting curves on the perpendicular faces. Once rough cut on the bandsaw, the handles are finally cut using a jig made earlier and a bearing-guided bit on the router table. If only one handle is being made, this step could be skipped and the bandsaw marks can be cleaned up by hand, but this method produced an identical curve on all four sides and it needed minimal cleanup. PantoRouter owners with Bosch routers might recognize these little wooden handles, which were removed from the fixed router base that comes with the motor. They work great for jigs. While we were at the bandsaw, we also cut some strips a bit thicker than 1/8 inch for the inlay on the mallet head. Then we took them over to the drum sander to bring them down to the final thickness until they fit nicely in the previously cut slots. While the glue dries on the inlaid pieces, we eased the edges of the handle and sanded until it was as close to the final product as possible. This is much easier to do before gluing it into the mallet head. Now we're ready for the final glue up. With the glue applied to the tenon, assemble the mallet, and a few knocks on the workbench with the mallet held vertically ensures that the tenon is seated all the way. Then tap the bandsaw cut wedges to secure the handle in place. After the glue is dry, trim the protruding wedges to roughly the same height as the end of the tenon. Then we head back to the PantoRouter to trim the through tenon flush, with the depth set so the bearing of the pattern routing bit references off the head of the mallet. The PantoRouter does a great job of flush cutting the end grain of that dense wood of the handle. All it takes now is a little bit of sanding, and we're left with a beautiful, perfectly fitting wedge through tenon. Do a little bit of cleanup of the inlays and the final sand, and it's ready for finish. This is a great and quick project using the PantoRouter that'll really put a smile on your face every time you use it. Please show us your take on the bench mallet as well as the projects you knocked together with it. Happy PantoRouting!